So one thing to consider before installing the latest version of Nexus is that it needs actually a bigger size of memory on the server that it's going to be installed and it's going to run on. And because of that, we're going to install Nexus on a droplet that has a little bit more capacity. So in the create droplet view, we have Ubuntu, we have basic plan, and we're actually going to go with this one here, which has 8 gigabytes of memory because Nexus needs higher memory capacity. It could also work with this one, but just to be sure, we're going to go with this here. And this is also to simulate and mimic the actual production environment, because when you're installing Nexus in your company and setting it up, you actually want to have enough resources on the server that the Nexus is running so that it doesn't run out of storage for components and so on. Your closest region, and you can create the droplet. The droplet has been created. And once we configure the firewall for this one to be accessible via port 22, we can actually access it using the IP address. I have already attached the firewall rule here, and we just need to install Java version 17 because that's the specific version that Nexus supports. So now we can SSH into our droplet with the root user and the IP address, and we can begin the installation of Nexus on the server. So let's start by installing the correct version of Java. If I execute a Java command here, you can see no version is installed. So we can run apt install version 17, which is this one right here, and let's execute this. So let's clear this up. And now if I run Java version, I can see that we have the correct version installed for Nexus. And now we can go ahead and install Nexus. So first we're going to move into /opt folder, and we're going to download Nexus package in this folder. So we're going to get the latest version from Nexus. If we search for Nexus download in our browser, we can open the link from Sonatype, which will contain the Nexus download. And here you see the different operating system links. So one for Unix systems, one for Windows, and one for macOS. If we right click and copy the link address of the Unix archive, we can head back to our terminal and use wget and paste the URL here. So with this command, we're just downloading the tar file of Nexus. So I'm going to execute this. And if I do ls, you see we have the tar file now locally. Now we're going to untar this package. And if I do ls again, you see there are two folders that got untarred from this package. We have the Nexus folder and Sonatype work. Now, why do we have these two directories, or what are the differences between them? First one, the Nexus directory itself contains the runtime and the application of Nexus itself. So here are the binaries to start Nexus application. And Sonatype work /Nexus actually contains your own configuration for Nexus and the data. This means that when you upgrade to a new version of Nexus Repository Manager, you replace the Nexus directory, the application directory, with the binaries, but you still keep the custom configuration and repository data in Sonatype work. So the splitting into two directories where you have the configuration and application separately actually makes sense for such cases. So the Sonatype work directory is created as a sibling, so to say, to the Nexus application directory. And Nexus knows the location of this directory through its properties file. And the Sonatype work /Nexus will actually contain a number of directories, number of subdirectories, depending on what you configure in Nexus itself. So for example, you can install plugins in Nexus. And if you do, different subdirectories will appear in this folder. This directory also contains a file that has a log of all the IP addresses that accessed or is accessing the Nexus application. It also contains logs of Nexus application itself, And also it stores the actual components, so the archives, the files that you are uploading to Nexus and the metadata to them. And many other files and subdirectories that contain different sets of information. And we're going to see some of those in action in a later part. But another thing to mention here is that you can actually use this folder to back up all the Nexus data. Since this folder contains all the data, all the storage, all the configuration, the plugins, etc., if you back up this folder, then you can actually recover the data in Nexus if something happens to the server where Nexus is running. And in this folder, there is Nexus executable, so we can start the service from here. However, before we do that, it's important to note that we shouldn't start services generally with root user, right? We shouldn't give services basically root user privileges because of security reasons. So the best practice is to create an own Linux user for such services, and then start the application or start that service with that specific user that has only the permissions it needs to run the application and to interact with the application, but definitely not the privileges of root user. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a Nexus user right now. So I'm going to do a user Nexus. It is going to ask me for a password. Let's set some password. Let's confirm that. Let's call it Nexus. And the user got created. Now let's clear the screen. And now if I check the permissions of the Nexus directories, both of them, the Nexus and Sonatype, you see that the owner is root user, and here you have the root group as well. And if we want to run the Nexus application with Nexus user, we need to change both of these directories' permissions or ownership to Nexus user. So Nexus user that we just created must be able to access both of these folders and subfolders in those in order to execute the application, the Nexus application from here, and also to make changes in this folder. So let's go ahead and do that using change owner command. With change owner command, we can change the ownership of those directories. We're going to do that recursively. Nexus user, Nexus group. Because when we created the Nexus user, the Nexus group was also created automatically. And we're going to change ownership to this user and group for this directory first. Let's do that. And then we'll do the same for Sonatype work. And now if I check the permissions again, you see both of the directories have Nexus user and group as owners. And this way we give Nexus user permission to execute the application in here and make changes to this folder where components are going to be stored, configurations will be adjusted, logs will be written, and so on. So Nexus user will do all of this, so it needs permission. And as a next step, we're going to set Nexus configuration so that it will run as a Nexus user. So we're going to do that in file called Nexus RC. And in this file, you see there's just one line which is commented out. So we're going to set this to Nexus run as user. So the service will run as user Nexus. Let's save it. And there you go. Nexus is configured. We have a Nexus user that has permissions to that folder. And now we can execute the service, or we can run the service with our Nexus user. To do that, we have to switch from root to Nexus. Let's do that. SU Nexus. And now you see I have switched to Nexus user. Let's clear this up. And now with this Nexus user, I can start the Nexus service. I'm going to do /opt Nexus bin. This is the executable. Nexus start. This is how we can start the service, starting Nexus. And now I can again check and make sure that it's running. And there you go. This is the Nexus service running. This is the process ID. And if I do netstat and identify the process ID, which is this one right here of Nexus, and here you see that it's accessible for external requests at port 8081. So this means if we want to access Nexus service from browser, we have to open port 8081 in our firewall configuration for our droplet. We have to configure our firewall rule to open inbound connection on this port. So we're going to do that right away. Let's go back to our droplet. Here you see we have firewall rules attached to our droplet, where we have incoming or inbound traffic opened at port 22 for SSH and 7071. So we're going to need to add another port here. So let's go to firewall and add another custom TCP rule. And this is going to be 8081 from all sources. Save. And now, if I take the IP address of the droplet and port 8081, see, our Nexus UI actually opens. So we have installed and set up Nexus on our Ubuntu server. As a next step, we can take a tour of Nexus UI and also upload some artifacts to Nexus Repository.